Sarah thinks that she's a dummy, so she has no real ambition. She just hopes that she gets lucky when the teacher grades exams. Johnny thinks he'd be successful if he only had a tutor, but he thinks that's not an option, so he doesn't make big plans. Heather knows that she's smart enough, and yes, she knows as well that all the help she needs is right nearby. But she doesn't feel encouraged, so she doesn't feel ambitious. She just drifts along and doesn't really try. Shantu feels encouraged, and he understands the lessons, but they're boring and irrelevant to him. He says to learn them would be useless. So his daily aspiration is to make it through until it's time for gym. Shantu used to be like Sarah, Johnny, Heather. Gregory used to be like Sarah, Johnny, Heather, and Shantu. But this year his teachers told him to believe that his brain is like a muscle, so that if he puts the work in, his high goals will be real possibilities. Gregory also knows that help will always be there if he needs it, so that even if the work gets really hard, his ambitions will be justified and not just idle dreaming. So he plans to try his best to go real far. Encouragement surrounds him, since his parents and his teachers try in many different ways to let him know that he's a very special person whose ambitiousness and progress makes them happier than they could ever show. Gregory knows that what he'll learn will be important, and he's expecting that the process will be fun. So he's feeling quite ambitious, looking forward to his lessons and to all the great success that is to come. Well, good evening and welcome to the first in a series of 3 evening forums that have been organized by the Achievement Gap at Harvard University. I'm Ron Ferguson. I teach at the Kennedy School, and I'm the faculty chair and director of the Achievement Gap Initiative. The Achievement Gap Initiative at Harvard is an effort to bring Harvard's research resources to bear on the nation's Achievement Gap challenge. There's a great deal of activity already going on among Harvard researchers that has importance for achievement gaps, but we have not in the past been well connected to one another to benefit from all the cross-fertilization that both we can achieve here at the university, but also through the various networks that faculty members have that help us to branch out across the nation and indeed around the world. So the aspiration is that over the next decade or more, we can start to build an extended community in and around Harvard that is dedicated to addressing achievement gap issues. And that's our aspiration, and this is really the first open public event that we've had as part of this project, even though we've done a few faculty seminars. You might ask, why is the achievement gap such a big issue now? It's only been over the last several years that you start to hear a lot about achievement gap issues in the media. People start to talk about it in public. I think there are 2 major reasons for this, and they're reasons that aren't going to go away, so it's going to be an issue for quite a long time. The first is that for the last 30-plus years, we've seen an increase in the value of the basic skills that schools teach, an increase in the value of having more years of schooling. And in order to achieve a middle-class lifestyle these days, you've just got to have good basic skills, and you need to have probably at least a high school education, if not more. So just in terms of the aspirations that we have for the quality of life that we'd like our population to achieve across all racial groups, it's important that we raise achievement, particularly among kids whose current levels are near the bottom. Beyond that, it turns out to be the case that the racial composition of the United States population is changing. By mid-century, there will be no racial majority group in the United States. Even whites will be a minority. Black and brown children will be the majority of the workforce. The United States international standing in many different ways, but particularly as an economy, will be dependent upon the quality of the educations that we provide to black and brown children now and over the next few decades. It's in everybody's interest across the entire society now to try to raise achievement for all children, but to pay particular attention to bringing up the bottom among those groups that tend to be behind academically. And that's the challenge that we're facing, along with lots of people around the country who share this agenda. We're organizing the faculty into research clusters, one on early childhood, another on that we are sort of representing today, called Race, Culture, Achievement, and Instruction. We might change that title some, but it's in all kinds of things that affect outcomes in K-12. There's a cluster on college access and success that will be hosting the forum that will take place here next Tuesday evening. The early childhood will be next Thursday. actually wanted to do early childhood, then the K-12, then the college access and success, but that didn't fit people's schedules, so hence the order that we actually have. There's another cluster on state and local regimes that will be focusing on how states and cities are organized politically and administratively to enforce accountability, No Child Left Behind, and just generally policies that should affect achievement levels and achievement gaps. This evening, our focus is on culture in a number of ways, and the emphasis of the evening is on the importance of becoming more conscious of the lenses with which we come to the discourse about culture. We have different backgrounds. We come with different ways of understanding what the cultural challenges are, different values with which to judge them, and we interact out of these ways of thinking. We view things through these lenses, and sometimes the differences in the ways we view things will stand in the way of us understanding one another. We tend often to oversimplify based upon the lens that we come from, the perspective that we come from. One of the standard perspectives these days on why we have achievement gaps, particularly between black and white kids, is that some kind of way there is a different achievement ideology among black students. They don't value it at achievement as much. All three of us on tonight's panel have done work that relates to this. None of us find any evidence of a different achievement ideology. Neither do our colleagues who are working on this issue in other places for the most part. On the other hand, we do find some evidence of behavior. We find lots of evidence, behavioral differences. We find evidence of differences in achievement levels and skill levels. So there are many differences that we need to talk about, we need to face up to, we need to deal with, but there's subtleties that we need to become more accustomed to talking about systematically. And in various ways, the three of us tonight will try to get at some of those subtleties and then open it up for a conversation with you. So let me introduce our speakers and get started. The first speaker will be Mica Pollock. Mica is an assistant professor of education here at the Graduate School of Education. She examines everyday ways that educators, students, administrators, and policymakers working at various levels in the education system argue over what to do about inequality and diversity in educational practice and policy. She also examines the everyday ways in which these people both realize and stymie their own equity efforts. Pollock intertwines investigations of equity policy in schools, districts, and federal government with investigations of equity practice in classrooms and communities. By making everyday disputes, dilemmas, and controversies over equality and difference themselves the phenomena for intellectual examination, she works practically to find ways to assist ordinary actors in education themselves to analyze, manage, intervene in, and make equitable their own educational systems. Mica received her master's degree in anthropology and her PhD in anthropology at the Anthropology of Education from Stanford. I should also mention that she recently, her book, Color Mute, Race Talk, Dilemmas in an American School, which is on sale in the hallway, recently won a book award from the American Educational Research Association, and we'd like to congratulate her for that. I should say Prudence has a book coming out in July that we can congratulate her on the awards for next year. Prudence Carter is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Harvard. Her primary research agenda focuses on cultural explanations of academic and mobility differences among various racial and ethnic groups. She's just completed the first phase of an international comparative school study in 4 schools in Cape Town and Johannesburg, South Africa, which examines the strains between mobility and culture for South African youth and the reproductions of a hierarchy of cultural meanings within schools, social groups, and communities. Prudence received her bachelor's degrees in applied mathematics and economics from Brown University, her master's in sociology and education from Teachers College, Columbia, and her PhD in sociology from Columbia. She also did postdoctoral work at the University of Michigan and joined the sociology department at Harvard as an assistant professor in 2001. I will be your moderator. My name is Ron Ferguson. I'm an economist by training. I've been at the Kennedy School for about 20 years, or 22 years actually, and I've been working on achievement gap issues for about the last 10, and I think that's all the introduction for myself that I'll do right now, and I want to invite Mica to start us off.
Ooh.
Okay.
Yikes. You okay? Okay, I'm going to claim this water here. Ron, you'll have to cut me off. I have too much to say, but this feels like a sort of manifesto.
Well, look over here every once in a while so I can remind you.
Okay. This feels like something of a manifesto moment, given that my work has thus far largely been about how we talk about and analyze the achievement gap. So I think it's fun to sort of start off this series of discussions about the achievement gap. And I do think that how we discuss and explain the achievement gap is really crucial. And one of the things I want to propose tonight is that our popular discourse, as well as our academic discourse, our everyday discourse in schools and districts, on the achievement gap actually reduces the notion of culture. And the one we're going to all be grappling with to some extent tonight is particularly difficult to shake, which is the notion that some cultures simply don't want to achieve, don't care to achieve, and this lodges in the attitudes of kids from particular groups. My own work on race talk has demonstrated, through looking at school and district everyday life, that these kinds of analyses have real consequences for kids. And so I've advocated in this recent article I wrote called Race Wrestling, that we race wrestle as researchers in education by struggling more openly with how we ourselves also talk about race and achievement, as well as looking at how sort of ordinary folks, which is a phrase I hate but still use, in practice struggle themselves to talk about the achievement gap. So my own data from my first book, Color Mute, was on a school and district in California, and noted that, as probably many of you who have done research have yourselves noted, that people's imaginings about the cultures of groups were sort of routine. And I found that in talking about and analyzing achievement disparities through imagining the cultural habits of groups, people tended to displace the analysis of gaps onto actors other than themselves. So one everyday example that I found in Columbus High School was that people muttered in a daily way about why black students were disproportionately wandering the hallways. I have a much more extended discussion of this in the book than I'm going to go into now. But what I found was that in their everyday mutterings about black students maybe just don't culturally care potentially as much about schooling, one of the main things they did through that very analysis was analytically overlook their own acts of creating this pattern in the hallway, such as more immediately sort of kicking out black kids than other kids when they entered the classroom into the hallway through disciplinary incidents, didn't analyze other facets of the phenomenon, such that, for example, kids from other groups in the high school who, when they cut school, they stayed home and watched television, as opposed to wandering the hallways. What I found is that sometimes in simplifying the analysis in the everyday life of schools and districts, in our own classrooms, lectures, etc., in academia, we overlook key aspects of the phenomena we're trying to analyze. And research talk about the achievement gap has real consequences for real life. The Fordham and Ogbu article that everybody always quotes and that Prudence is wrestling with all the time on acting white came out in 1986. Fred Erickson, an anthropologist of education, has a nice discussion about how immediately that argument about cultural practices of groups went into the media and how quickly it got picked up by NPR. And suddenly everybody went running to black students to grill them on how, rather than if, they avoided school achievement for racialized cultural reasons. And no matter how many times Ogbu, who is now deceased, and Fordham have tried to say, well, that's an oversimplification, wait, this argument about cultural behavior rolls on. So this is a real race talk problem in education. And I've argued in my own work that we screw up when we talk about the achievement gap in education. And of course, we also screw up when we don't talk about the achievement gap in education. I don't want to take any time right now to say how we screw up when we don't. What I mean by the color muteness is a term I've coined to describe that. Of course, if we don't ever mention achievement gaps, we normalize them, we naturalize them, we don't discuss solutions with people we need to work with, we don't discuss gaps and opportunities to learn, etc. So the assumption of this initiative, of course, is that we should talk about the achievement gap. And our first task tonight is to talk about the role of culture in the achievement gap. But what I found in my own work on race talk is that we screw up many times. And by screw up, I mean we do things that actually harm the kids we ostensibly are trying to assist. We screw up when we talk about the role of culture in education. How do we do this? A couple general things before I talk about how we screw up when we use cultural analyses in particular. I found that when we talk about the achievement gap generally in education, be it in the school hallway or in the university classroom, we screw up often with certain kinds of blame talk. Education is a field that's really saturated by blame. Sometimes it seems like that's what we're about, is blaming. We have a habit, I think, I make claims in this book about American race talk, shared by everyone in this room, that blames other people for achievement gaps. We have a tendency to talk as if we expect racial achievement gaps to be produced by somebody else. We have a tendency to talk about achievement gaps too matter-of-factly, as if they don't bother us anymore, and we throw up another graph onto the screen and sort of yawn about it, etc. So there are many ways we screw up for kids when we talk generally about the achievement gap. I want to just talk tonight about how we screw up when we bring in, I think, the issue of culture. I think we have a habit of reductive talk and analysis in educational research practice, etc. in the United States, where we blame isolated groups for achievement patterns, rather than seeing a larger, what I would call cultural choreography. What other people have called an institutional choreography, if you look within a school unit of analysis. We replicate a habit of reductive comparison, where we take group A and compare it to group B, and what we're comparing are imagined assumptions about their internal motivations. So we compare how black kids feel about school to how Filipino kids feel about school, etc. And I think that these reductive comparisons are very dangerous for young people. For one thing, as Ron already said, they ignore the fact that we'll use black and Latino kids in this case because that was sort of the premise of this evening in the introduction. Ignores the fact that black and Latino kids, for example, share larger cultural or American orientations to achievement, and that's a consensus among scholars here, and a growing consensus that all groups share a schooling orientation, a sort of American schooling orientation about an ideology of achievement. So Professor Carter, Prudence, is going to be talking more about how people misread the sort of cultural orientations of others. But there are other ways, I think, that our reductive analysis of culture in education hurts kids. One is that we reduce culture, and I'm an anthropologist, so that's why I said this feels like a sort of manifesto. I think when I got here as an anthropologist to the ed school, people thought I was going to study this very thing. And I don't mean my colleagues. I just mean everybody thinks this about anthropologists. That culture is a set of traits owned by group X. And we tend in education, I think, to lodge blame for achievement gaps. I keep pointing to the screen as if there's a chart there. But imagine a chart there. And we lodge blame for gaps in the habits of a group, as if that group acts in isolation. What we do not do is the kind of cultural analysis that I, as an anthropologist, try and hammer into my students' toolkits, which is to analyze the full cultural ecology of actors and forces that produce the achievement gap. The full cultural world of the classroom, if that's what we want to call a unit of analysis, the city, the nation. So if you want to just remember two things from what I'm saying tonight, two ways of expanding the cultural analysis. I believe, and I find from reading other research, that good cultural analysis sees kids in interaction with others, and good cultural analysis sees kids in contexts. And I think that's something that both of my colleagues here will be reinforcing. So I think in education we promote a very reductive notion of how cultures, as if they are vacuum-sealed containers, vacuum-sealed through the ages, pass down motivations. Rather than seeing young people struggling in larger cultural contexts that shape them as racialized beings, that expects certain things of them, and that they participate in reshaping. So we have a tendency in education and the way we talk about culture to imagine kids showing up to school fully culturally formed. And I think this framing of culture as the stuff that kids bring from home can be useful in one sense if it has us noting key ways in which homes and schools differ, in which everyday ways of talking in classrooms differ, etc. But it can be very harmful if it ignores the other actors and forces that interact in shaping kids' behaviors and to which they are responding. And I think regarding the achievement gap, this reduction is particularly dangerous. So instead of just asking over and over, what do different cultures of kids, how do they think differently about education? I think we should ask other kinds of what I would call cultural questions that have us asking, how do kids interact in the full cultural context of multiple actors, including us, who make intertwined moves. How do young people interact with adults in schools, in classrooms, in the nation, in ways that produce the achievement gap? When we look in schooling contexts, whose decisions and everyday moves, create the gap? Which of those everyday moves, this is something very important to me. I'm organizing a book right now called Everyday Anti-Racism, where I'm inviting 100 people to write really super short essays about everyday moves to intervene in things like the achievement gap. Whose everyday moves create the gap, and which of those moves can be tweaked to enable kids as opposed to harm them? Which of young people's behaviors, this is something that Dr. Ferguson is interested in, which of young people's behaviors enable young people in the schooling context, which are self-sabotaging in the schooling contexts that exist? So I think we have to not reduce the analysis of what culture in education means, because this then promotes a very reduced analysis, and this is crucial, of what is necessary to do to equalize achievement. And to me, I think this question, to continually ask whether Black and Latino kids, for example, culturally care less about education is sort of like the constant quest in other arenas of research or the world to distinguish nature from nurture, for example, in the gender arena. If you saw Evelyn Fox Keller, she gave a great talk a couple weeks ago about this false notion that somehow if we just try hard enough, we're going to analytically separate nature from nurture, the stuff internal to the group from the influence of context, nurture. But what the point she made very clearly was that all entities, whether it's a group, an individual, a gene, is constantly interacting with the context. And trying to imagine something internal to Black kids, for example, trying to understand what is just nature as opposed to nurture is kind of like hearing a drum in the distance and saying, how much of that drumming, she said, was produced by the drummer, and how much of it by the drum? Okay, so the idea of these patterns being produced in interaction as opposed to produced by a group of people who bring a sort of vacuum-sealed container of stuff to school. This is particularly a problem, I've talked to Vivian Louie about this, with a discourse, sorry Vivian, of Asian achievement, which particularly imagines a culture of sort of immemorially, that's a word, passed down through the ages, I don't think it is a word, but vacuum sealed. And Vivian's work does a nice turn of cultural analysis to say, actually, let's look at how Chinese families in New York City interact with the schooling system of New York City. And let's look at how the schooling system of New York City interacts with Chinese American parents and kids, as opposed to imagining the cultural baggage that people just haul in with them to school. We tend to do this reductive, isolated thinking when we study all kinds of things in education. When we study neighborhoods, people have argued, we imagine neighborhoods in isolation as if a neighborhood's problems was only because of stuff internal to the neighborhood, as opposed to disinvestments in a neighborhood, larger forces, etc. Linda Powell has a nice quote that I use all the time about people focused on trying to understand the role of Black kids in Black underachievement, she quotes, systematically ignore, she argues, for example, the role that white people play in producing Black underachievement. So similarly, analyzing in isolation, asking what is it about Asian kids that makes them achieve? Isolated analysis. And I think that this leads us to false conclusions, empirically, but also analytically false conclusions that actually hurt kids. So I think a real cultural analysis recognizes that all kids are interacting with the context, and that these kinds of interactions shape everyday schooling experiences, that interactions between a young person in a particular kind of classroom context shapes that young person's specific reactions to a specific teacher, the interactions shape the skill sets that lead young people to turn in homework or not turn in homework. That interactions between peers in a classroom context shape whether that young person is going to raise their hand and answer a question, or how that young person will raise their hand and answer a question. So I think we need to sort of zoom in more and do this kind of cultural analysis. I think when we think about culture and socialization and education, I think we've kind of gotten the idea that parents socialize their kids. Largely, Bob Levine, who is here, was key to that. We've gotten to some extent the idea that peers socialize their peers, but I think what we haven't really done is this sort of full ecology cultural analysis, where we look at how various actors shape kids, and how kids then, in interaction with teachers, with deans, with the kid sitting in the seat next to you, with a parent, with the television, how kids then produce themselves. So let me just cite a couple things before I head out here. This went much faster than I thought. What we gain.
Only got about 3 minutes left.
What we gain. What we miss, why don't we say it this way, when we don't see kids in an interactive context. And this is coming out of a tradition in the anthropology of education that I've found very illuminating. And this is a tradition of sort of interactional analysis that has zoomed in extremely closely to the practices of classrooms. People who have, my advisor in graduate school says that he spent a year analyzing 5 minutes of tape, which sounds kind of mind-boggling. But he found some very interesting things, and others have as well. People have seen, when they look interactionally at the larger culture of the classroom, for example, that whether a young person looks up to meet the eye of a teacher has everything to do with how that teacher is interacting with her. And if you didn't see that interaction, you might imagine that the young person who, when the teacher suddenly turns around, puts her head down on her desk, you might imagine that that young person is not paying attention. You might imagine even that that young person has no interest in answering the question. We've seen through this kind of research, and I can give you sites later if you want them, how by shifting curriculum and pedagogy slightly, English language learners, for example, who in one pedagogical context seem as if they do not have advanced knowledge of English, slight pedagogical shifts, interactional shifts, can allow these young people to produce English that demonstrates, in fact, an advanced understanding of English. So slight pedagogical shifts. And if we didn't look this way, for example, at Latino English language learners, we might think they couldn't read at all or didn't want to read. So we miss things in ways that harm children by not doing the kind of systematic cultural analysis that I'm suggesting. Okay, let me just finish. Audrey Thompson calls color talk the kind of systemic talk about the achievement gap that I'm recommending, by which she says explicitly naming the mechanisms by which these racialized patterns and orders are maintained. I call it skillful race talk. Why don't we name all the mechanisms through which these orders are produced? And I think it's really crucial to name the full set of actors and forces and mechanisms involved in producing things like this achievement gap graph that's up on here. Because if we don't name and analyze those various forces, practices, mechanisms that produce this, then we simply can't figure out what each of us needs to do to unproduce this. And I think what then happens is the analysis gets lodged simplistically in the behaviors and imagined motivations of other people. So the everyday analysis, everyday anti-racism that I'm suggesting is very much about unpacking the production of racial inequality into its real component parts so that each person, and this might sound utopian, but oh well, so that each person can say today, and a lot of educators want these kinds of tools. Today, what might I do slightly differently to intervene in this? So that's the kind of cultural analysis I think we need more of in education, and I'm done. Thank you.
Good evening. Well, I'm happy to be here this evening to talk a bit about my research, and as we reflect over this concept is it okay that I took that down?
Good.
Okay, sure. On this concept of the academic achievement gap and where does culture fit into the picture. I'm a sociologist by training, and I identify as one who focuses on social stratification, but increasingly so I've become a cultural sociologist. And when I talk about culture tonight, and when I talk about culture in general, I talk about culture as a variegated social concept. And what I mean by that is that I talk about culture from the perspectives of individuals who participate and practice certain forms. I talk about groups who cohere around shared taste and interest and ideology and values. I also talk about organizations or institutions as cultural actors. And one of the things that has been accorded so much attention in the academic achievement research is the idea that there are certain cultural forms that exist among groups of individuals, and it has displaced quite a bit of attention from the cultural formations or practices of organizations and institutions themselves. And so what I want to talk today about is the interactions between two types of cultural actors, the students and the school as a cultural place. Let me read a quote to you from a sociologist named Mark Gould, and I quote, he says, "When the major institutions in society are constructed within the culture and interest of one group instead of another, even when the subordinate group is included within those institutions, its performances will be, on average, less proficient than the dominant group." End of quote. In the research that I've done over the last 8 years, what I've tried to come to understand is the interplay between the cultural logic of schooling itself and the practices and behaviors that the students engage in, express, or exhibit in the classroom. And one of the ways that I am arguing in my new book to understand or try to understand from a cultural vantage point the full participation of students in school is to often to think about their attachment to school, the affective component of engagement. And that is the degree to which they feel they fit in or embedded in or accepted in a cultural institution called a school. Now, it's become fashionable these days, or for many years now, as Mica has said, to assert that many African American, and I dare say Latinos and Native American students reject academic excellence because they perceive certain behaviors as the province of white middle-class folks, and that they thus reject these behaviors because they perceive them as acting white. And social scientists and journalists alike, educators, other practitioners, invoke this notion as they seek to report on the achievement gap because they see that's how culture matters. Let's think about the students themselves as agents, as practicing, as engaging in the process, and they're becoming resistant individuals because they don't foresee any way of advancing themselves sometimes, or they take a very kind of disillusioned approach to education. Well, many of us have actually disproven that, as Ron has argued. But one of the things that I have found, and there are 4 arguments that I want to make that I think we need to consider more as we think about this role of culture, is that, first of all, as Mark Gould has argued, in our society, not all groups, but rather a few, get to define what knowledge is or to define the images of what intelligence is or what an intelligent student would look like. And the students in my study express their awareness of these dynamics, wrestling with the perceived unfairness or inherent inequality in this. If a pupil did not conform to these images, no matter how sharp his or her native ability, he was most likely to be marginalized or perceived as rebellious or anti-authority, and that had consequent effects on his or her engagement, on his engagement. And I argue in my book that this further perpetuates a certain type of social inequality in our society. It's a certain type of social inequality that's fundamentally embedded in the cultural formations of our schools. Second, the argument that I make in this book is that this persistent view and predominant view that a reactive culture towards white middle-class ways of being engenders attitudes and values among African American children that inhibit their academic achievement is problematic because there has been so much evidence, as I found in others, that the ethno-racial cultures of young African Americans maintain positive functions, subscribe fully to dominant achievement ideology. But one of the things that we haven't stepped back to do is to actually contend with the positive functions of the cultural formations that these young people actually create themselves. And what do I mean by that? Why is it important for young people to cohere around shared styles and taste, ways of presentation that we may find problematic in the school, in the classroom, because they don't necessarily cohere to the dominant images or controlling images of what an academic or successful student would be? Well, the cultural presentations of self that young African American students often bring into the classrooms, I would argue, are better understood as practices of distinction based on a critique of an undiscerning mainstream culture in schools rather than a submission to powerlessness, an omission, or a rejection of all of the things that it takes to be upwardly mobile in American society. Let me say that again. The cultural presentations of self, I would argue, that young people oftentimes bring with them into schools are better understood as practices of distinction based on a critique of an undiscerning mainstream culture in schools, based on a critique of the logic of how culture plays out in schools, rather than a submission to powerlessness and oppression and a rejection of mainstream or dominant achievement ideology. In the research that I had done, I found that there were three types of groups of students, and these were all low-income kids. Most of them were dependent, their families were dependent on AFDC in the 1990s until the massive changes that were done to the social welfare programs. But what I found is a spectrum, a number of students who ran the gamut in terms of their actual academic achievement profiles. Some of them were highly achieving. They were in AP and advanced honors and gifted courses, and some of them were just hanging on to barely hanging on in school and were on the verge of dropping out of school. And I wanted to understand why that how that heterogeneity, why it existed among these kids who've all been homogenized through the master cultural narrative that's been used in the educational research literature. And what I found was that the degree to which students were actually attached to school or engaged to school actually was dependent on the kind of cultural ideology as well as racial ideology that they subscribed to. There were three types. The first group, whom I call the cultural mainstreamers, were the ones who were least likely to believe that there needed to be some kind of major transformation in the cultural logic of schooling. And basically they felt that the way that group members like themselves could only achieve in society was by fully subscribing to the practices and policies that had been already set forth and fully acculturating. In some ways, embracing the sensibilities, the understandings, the codes and practices that our schools have given. They didn't problematize them. And those were the students who were most likely to be seen as the students who conformed, well-behaved, the ones that teachers liked and understood. The second group of students, and these were students who also did pretty well in school, were the cultural straddlers. I called them the cultural stragglers. And what these students illuminated for me in the research was that there is indeed a tension between the home culture or even ethno-specific practices that emerge in peer spaces and in neighborhoods and the culture that's embedded within schools. Well, what these students did quite strategically and quite effectively was that they were able to straddle both worlds. They were able to read the cultural rules of both spaces, and dare I say multiple spaces, in a way where they could deploy their identities effectively and even acquire the kind of approval and positive evaluation of their teachers. But finally, there were the non-compliant believers. And why do I call them the non-compliant believers? Because any survey, nationally representative survey you go to, will show that across the board, across classes and races and ethnicities, most of us subscribe to dominant achievement ideology, the idea that education matters to success. So they all believed, but they didn't all, this particular group didn't achieve highly, as opposed to the cultural mainstreamers and the straddlers. And why was that? This was the group that was most fundamentally critical of the way the schools operated, of the way the schools policed their bodies, of the way the schools policed their styles, and of the way the schools policed their interactions with each other and with their teachers. Now, mind you, I'm not suggesting that these students themselves didn't have any problems. In fact, most of them needed some support, some guidance in how to actually translate their critique in a way that would be acceptable or that a way could be heard by the cultural gatekeepers of schools. But they were not effective at that. And as a result, these non-compliant believers, people who believed in schools, often wrestled and conflicted with their teachers in the school. The third point that I want to make, the thing, after finding these three kinds of students among a certain class group, these were all poor students, and they all did very differently in terms of their academic achievement. One of the things that this suggested to me in my research is that the story of how young students, African American students, deploy culture to gain status is very complex. It is a heterogeneous story. Unfortunately, we have homogenized it in our telling of it. And their behaviors are better understood as a continuum rather than a fixed singular cultural narrative. So in conclusion, what I was able to gather is that some students comply with the dominant or mainstream cultural rules while others challenge them and create or maintain their own repertoire of cultural codes and meanings. The third major argument of my book is that students' differences in attachment and engagement to school, which ultimately will have some influence or effect, and certainly sociologist Robert Johnson, Robert Krosno, and Glenn Elder have found that engagement, or the affective component of attachment to school, does have a correlation to actual grades in schools. And one of the things that, so going back to this point, the third argument is that the differences in attachment and engagement to school are connected actually to the ideologies, this cultural ideologies that these students hold about how in-group members should act or respond to social inequalities in our society, respond to exclusionary practices or discrimination. Some will take a more assimilative route, some will take a more kind of bicultural strategy, and some will say, that's just plain wrong, and I will resist it or reject it. And finally, I argue in this book, in the research, in thinking about the homogenization of the cultural narrative, that there is another very important factor that we've missed when thinking about the black-white achievement gap, and it gets at the intersections among identities, and that is there is an untold, or at least an undertold, gender story here. And in the research that I've done, I found that the group that was most likely to be to comprise the non-compliant believer groups were the males in my study, and that there is an increasing gender divide among black students when it comes to academic engagement and attachment. It's not to suggest that these boys don't have the ability, because many of them actually remain in school to get that credential so that they can actually take alternative trajectories into upward mobility in our society. Unfortunately, they're not doing it in the conventional way, and that we actually need to think about how to approach that as well. So, in conclusion, throughout this book, I engage with these cultural paradigms that are in existence in the sociology of education, as well as anthropology and educational in general. And I argue that if we want to think about how culture, identity, and education all work together in terms of how non-dominant or racially subordinate groups are incorporated in the schools, that we need to think in a much more complicated, a much more nuanced, and a much richer way, that it has been oversimplified to the point, and I think it's because it's a sexy thing. I'm often baffled why the media every other day has an article in a newspaper, if it's about black achievement, using or invoking the resistance to acting white explanation. And it has been disproven so many times, and I realize it's because we haven't really done enough to think about the interplay between cultural actors, and nor have we done enough to understand really why the positive functions of groups of young people actually maintaining kind of particularistic and ethno-racial styles, and we don't know what to do with them because we have a kind of fixed cultural logic in our schools. So I'll stop there, and I certainly will welcome questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
I want to go through now what may seem a jerky transition. Okay.
Send it up there.
I think it's kind of up there. It was. There they go. So far, both Mica and Prudence have been reacting to what they think is an excessive tendency to locate the problem in the child, not to see problems that are embedded in the nature of the institution and the way the people in institutions respond. I'm going to react initially to what I see as a problem that people who would tend to agree with Prudence and Mica tend to fall into, which is the tendency not to want to be at all critical of black kids and Latino kids in the schools. And I want to start off with a poem that was provoked by a day that I spent 2 days moderating a discussion between among math educators, people who are who teach, or PhD people who are training people to be PhD math educators. I asked the question, I said, how do you figure out what it is kids don't know when they come in so you can be diagnostic and figure out where you need to fill in the gaps? They would not respond to the problem in that form. They kept correcting me to tell me, no, it's not what they don't know, it's what they do know, it's what their assets are that we can build upon. I could not get them into a conversation about what the gaps were in kids' presentation because they were so concerned about stigmatizing the young people. And there's no difference in my perspective with regard to anything you've heard so far, but some of the things I say now may make it sound like I don't agree. And really it's an issue about balancing. And I'm talking about balancing in the other direction. So this poem is called Educator Self-Censorship, or We Won't Say They Don't Know. And actually, where did I leave my watch? Did I leave it over there?
No.
Okay, I found it. No, I didn't. I want to be able to watch the time.
Oh, you don't have a watch.
Well,
You're wearing one.
I am wearing my watch. All right. Thank you very much. I had it off over there when I was watching the time for them. All right.
Time's out.
All right, calm down. Okay. There are words we dare not whisper. No, those words we dare not say, for our enemies they listen, poised to pounce from where they lay. Therefore we must be quite careful, speaking only foolproof words, so bigots cannot misinterpret what they think they heard. If we hint at any weaknesses or injuries or hurts, then the critics and the bigots will then use them to assert that the people we are serving are an undeserving lot, whose frailties and transgressions make them all a hopeless blot. So we mustn't utter any sound that might be overheard by those lurking here among us waiting to distort our words. No, instead we will self-censor, so that nothing that we say can be used against our values in a wrong or hurtful way. Never mind that this prevents us from addressing like we could all the deficits our work could fill, the ways we could do good. And instead of striking out to prove that injuries can heal, we'll assert that they do not exist. We'll say that they aren't real. We will say that every child arrives with knowledge equal value, and the differences are absent, or at least that's what we'll tell you. We'll declare that some arrive with more, but none arrive with less. We'll deny the contradiction, our semantics at their best. But that cannot be the answer. No, there is a better way. We must not allow the bigots to restrict what we can say, for we know that there are differences in how students arrive. There are differences in what they know, what they've done to survive. Our opponents seek to blame the victim, giving them the rap. Nonetheless, we must admit the truth. There really are some gaps. Sure, every child has assets, and most have loving home relations, but some nonetheless arrive with larger holes in their foundations. And we must find where there's confusion and then help kids understand, giving generous encouragement while firm in our demands. Believing in their potential, we will teach to meet their needs, filling deficits with knowledge, helping every child succeed. Then the critics and the bigots that we now seem so to fear will have long since fallen silent, may have simply disappeared. There are words we dare not whisper. No, those words we'd better shout. There's a lot of work to do now that we've let the secret out. Okay. And so it's a matter of striking the balance. And my orientation is not to shy away from talking about things that some folks might think are stigmatizing, that might tend to build stereotypes, because I'm doing it not to create the stereotype, but to lay before us the work there is to be done so that we can face up to it and get it done and stop worrying about people listening over our shoulders and misusing what we might say when we talk about what needs to happen. So in the things I put on the slide for PowerPoint, I put a number of things that have the character of being the kinds of things sometimes we don't like to talk about in public, but that we need to at least face up to because they're part of what we need to deal with. The first several things are things that are sort of broader context, and then I'm going to come back around quickly to some findings from, I've been surveying students in mostly suburban schools actually for several years now, and there's some patterns of difference in these data that I wanted to talk about that one could regard as stigmatizing, but there are also some patterns that suggest that really good teachers can overcome a lot of the problems that we talk about. And the slide that's on the screen right now, and I wish I had a handheld mic, or if there's somebody that's got a lapel mic handy, I can step out and actually look at what I'm talking about. Or thank you. The slide that's on the screen now is just, I put up here to respond to those folks, to the folks who say, why do we have to pay so much attention to test scores? What's the big deal with test scores? They don't predict anything. Well, I got interested in test scores around 1990 when I dropped a test score into a wage equation and knocked out half the black-white hourly wage gap. Okay? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining the diagram that's on the screen right now, but the long blue lines are the black-white hourly wage gap for men ages 23 to 35 in the late 80s, early 90s. That the long blue lines are the wage gap if you don't control for test scores. The short purple lines are what's left of the wage gap after you control for test scores. Okay? They really do predict. This is the Armed Forces Qualifications Test in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And so I don't want to linger on that for a while, but that's what got me interested in test scores. Okay, quickly, just the NAEP scores, there really are some big achievement gaps. There's work we need to do. These are aggregated over the 1990s by region and urban, rural, central city. For whites on this side, for blacks on this side, you see the lowest for whites are rural southeast. That's higher than the highest for blacks. The highest for blacks is a suburban northeast. One of the interesting things is that rural southern blacks now have higher test scores than central city northern blacks do. There was a time when people left the rural south to go to the city for a better quality of life. Kids in the north living in the central city now have higher test scores than black kids in the south living in rural areas. Just work to do. SAT scores, big gaps. We're not going to pause on these. Big gaps in college graduation rates by race and important gender patterns, but again, I'm not going to dwell on them. Percentage of kids in two-parent families. This is the dramatic diagram. This is the blue bars are the percentage of black kids living in two-parent families in census years, going from 68% in 1960 down to 33% by 2000. For white kids, from 93% in 1960 down to 79% by 2000. Okay, this is not good. These are things that we need to deal with. Talking about some of the issues tied up in only a third of black kids living in two-parent families could be stigmatizing kinds of conversations, but we need to have them. We need to work on them because they have implications for school readiness. And equations I run, single-parent households tend to predict behavior outcomes, or be among the things that predict weaker behavior in school, and behavior is a big deal. Now, a little bit here on differences across classrooms. And here, I divided classrooms into 4 types. These are about 500 elementary school classrooms, mostly in suburbs. And I divided them into classrooms distinguished by whether they were above or below average on whether the teacher loves to help them. And this is, you see here 3 different ways of asking, does your teacher love to help you? And whether a teacher puts an emphasis on learning to get the answers right. And this is a couple questions that have to do with whether in the classroom there's an emphasis on learning to get the answers right. And so I have 4 kinds of classrooms characterized by whether they're above or below average on each of these things. So we have classrooms that are high on both what I call help and perfectionism. Help is my teacher loves to help us. Perfectionism is she's always talking about we got to learn to get things right. And you'll see the other 4 combinations of things here. And I'm going to go fairly rapidly through this. But then I'm interested in the degree to which, and I should say, I'm going to break classrooms up in a second into classrooms that are vast majority non-white, non-Asian, those that are 25 to 50% white and Asian, and majority white and Asian, those 3 groups. Within each of those 3 groups, there's very little difference in the kids' home backgrounds across these 4 classroom types. So I've got whether they live with 2 parents or a single parent, I have a number of computers in the house, I have a number of siblings in the house, I have whether they ever speak a different language at home. The socioeconomic background of the kids is pretty much the same across the 4 classroom types. It appears to be the teacher and the way that the teacher interacts with students that it drives the difference here. And then I want to know the degree to which across those 4 classroom types teachers think kids want to learn. I call this is the slackers index. You'll see that the items up here, the kids don't seem to care about enough about doing well. They don't ask for help when they need it. They don't complete their work on a regular basis because of effort. They make excuses for not doing their work even when it's relatively easy. The more a teacher believes those things about their kids, the more the teacher is basically saying, oh, my kids are just slackers. They don't want to learn. Now, then there's classmate collegiality, the student's perception about whether other students are supportive in the classroom. Kids like to help each other learn. They help each other if they make a mistake. And then 2 negatives. They tell you when they do better than you, and some kids tease you if you make a mistake. Put that in another index I call classmate collegiality. And I want to know how these differ across those 4 classroom types, where, again, I'm finding virtually no socioeconomic background differences across those 4 classroom types. And I characterize the classroom, I should say, by how the kids as a whole, how the class as a whole characterizes it. So it's not an individual student's opinion that leads to the characterization of the classroom. It's how the whole composite. And then the question is the composite characterization above or below average. Okay. Now, one thing to point out that could be viewed as stigmatizing to talk about in public is that even as of first grade, this was the 4th entry, the teasing, some classmates tease kids who make mistakes. Even as of first grade, there are racial differences. There's a racial pattern in teasing for making mistakes. And teasing for making mistakes predicts anxiety across all racial groups in the classroom. The more teasing for making mistakes kids report, the more worry they report that they might not measure up to their classmates. And anxiety then interferes with concentration, which can interfere with achievement. So the basic line here is that the black bars are classrooms that are less than 25% white and Asian. That's the 55% of the kids in first grade who are in classrooms that are vast majority non-white, non-Asian. 55% of kids agree classmates in our class tease kids who make mistakes. And that trends up toward 60% by 5th grade. Now, these first graders don't even know why they're doing all of these things. I mean, it just can be kind of fun. But, and it can be something that trickles down from a sophisticated critique of the system that the older kids might have, but some of it they're learning from places other than just through a critique of school. Teachers need to be equipped to help kids not harass each other in ways that interfere with concentration and achievement. The yellow bars are majority white and Asian classrooms. That's about high 30s, and it goes down toward low 30s by 5th grade. So it's almost 2 to 1 by 5th grade. And even the numbers among the majority white and Asian classrooms are too high with regard to the amount of teasing that goes on. The bottom line here is that the type of classroom, let's jump to this right quick, that kids are in does seems to make a big difference with regard, for example, to whether the teacher thinks the kids want to learn. The red bars are the low help, low perfectionism. Our teacher doesn't seem like to help us, but at least she doesn't hassle us about getting stuff right. The dark blue bars are low help, high perfectionism. Our teacher's always talking about we got to get stuff right, but she doesn't seem like she wants to help us. The yellow bars are high help, low perfectionism. Our teacher really seems like she loves to help us, and she doesn't hassle us when we don't get things right. And the checkerboard bars are high help, high perfectionism. Our teacher seems to like to help us a lot, but she says we're never really done till we know how to do it the right way. Okay? If you get a high perfectionism, high help class, even when it's vast majority non-white, non-Asian, those teachers believe as much in those kids as majority white and Asian classrooms do in those kids. And it turns out, especially among classrooms that are mostly black kids, the only kind of classroom where kids persist at a high level across the whole school year is if it's a vast majority non-white, non-Asian, are the classrooms of that 4th type that are high help and high perfectionism. The height of these bars is the fall off from I plan to do my best quality work in this class all year, measured in the fall, to I have done my best quality work in this class all year, measured in the spring. There's a big drop off. If in non-white, non-Asian classrooms, they aren't in that style of classroom where they got a teacher who loves to help and holds them to a high standard. I'm going to stop now because my time is it's not all the way up, but I want to leave time for discussion. And just tell you that I have a similar analysis that is for secondary school students, where at the secondary level I've got kids, lots of kids, in 2 different classes. So I run the analysis in a way that asks how differently do they answer the questions for the 2 different classes. And what I find is that when I divide kids in those same 4 kinds of classroom environments, the high help, high perfectionism classroom is far superior to the others with regard to students having a mastery orientation and really want to learn the material, with regard to their behavior. In fact, the biggest effect sizes are for self-reported behavior of being in that high classroom. And this is only using within student variation the same kid answering the questions in different classrooms. So it is the case that black kids self-report worse behavior than the white kids do. But they self-report much better behavior in the classrooms of teachers who love to help them and hold them to high standards. Okay, and the challenge for us is to find ways so that all adults who interact with kids in settings where they can have academically enriching experience will learn how to signal to students that I love to help you, I'm in your corner, but I know you can do it, and I'm holding you to a high standard. And I'll stop at that. Do you want to do a wrap-up, or do you want to open it up?
Did you have synthesized things you want to?
No.
Do you want to say anything?
No, we talked yesterday about taking a minute to synthesize before we open it up to the audience.
Well, I had the benefit of going first, so I would say one thing. Just a couple threads I noticed. From Prudence, I think the takeaway point for me was that the analysis that students were reacting, that students do react not against the intellectual project of education itself, or to the notion of upward mobility itself, but rather to the institutional arrangements of the actual schools they encounter. I think that's a very different kind of analysis. From both of these presentations, the notion that we need to, I think a little less about sort of a priori ingrained attitudes from people, but rather look really carefully at how actual behaviors in schools, and from Ron's presentation in classroom contexts, really make a difference in producing or not producing these gaps. I think this finding that the everyday behaviors that teachers employ with young people are central is a really crucial finding. Because I think also, and I'll stop after this, a lot of time when we talk about racism in education, a lot of time we talk about something as if it's simply attitudinal, that teachers have attitudes. And I think what we need more analysis of in education, if we're worried about achievement gaps, is how certain behaviors have certain effects that produce gaps. And thinking more about the cause and effects of actual classroom, school behaviors is the central thing I took from both of these talks.
You didn't tell me you were going to.
Sorry. Yeah, I think I want to kind of piggyback on what I took away from your comments, Mica, and also what I've taken away from your comments, Ron, is to think about these, how we talk about the achievement gap from a multidimensional perspective. And one of the things that I hate when I go to give these talks, I'm always afraid that we're going to convey that the bad guys are either the students or the teachers or the educators. And we're not talking about bad guys. We're talking about how to bridge multiple groups of cultural actors together so that they can facilitate the process better. So Ron talks about a culture of the classroom where the teachers who are most successful are the ones who figured out how to maintain certain kinds of values and also manage their students or interact with their students in a way where they also signal that they understand with their students. I'm presuming this. And what I argue is that these kinds of people are the ones who are going to be most effective in getting young people to engage or attach themselves to school, and that actually teachers as well as the kids have to be multicultural, if you will. That the high perfectionism or high help teachers are the ones who've kind of created this kind of classroom where the engagement in the academic behaviors achievement is much higher, have actually figured out how to communicate effectively with their students. And the students hear them, and the students are responding to them. And I think what that takes is actually having a certain kind of critical insight or understanding of the material and social realities and cultural realities of the kids who are in your classroom, and vice versa, by signaling that the students will respond and maybe even adapt their own behaviors in a way. So that's what I've kind of taken in terms of thinking about the multiple actors in the whole process.
Okay, we want to open it up now for discussion with you. Heather?
Hi.
Should we send people to the mic, I guess? Yes.
I want to thank the panel. But I have a question about, particularly in Mica talked about the blame game and the problem of blaming people in education in general. And Ron, you talked about these high-help teachers and the worry about stigmatizing. So I'm curious about what any of the panelists would say about how you actually support teachers in being high-help, high-perfectionists, learning, just like we're trying to get students to learn, how to build stronger relationships and how to do a better job of communicating their expectations and their support for students, given there are all these cultural explanations swirling and everybody's managing blame.
Okay. I should mention one of the things. I have a school intervention project called the Tripod Project. The Tripod stands for Content Pedagogy and Relationships. I mean, teachers need to know their subject, be able to explain things in ways that students can understand, and be able to connect with teachers. And it's one of the applications of the kind of survey research that I reported some numbers from today is I give schools reports that show them what I call the range of classroom conditions. So for every item on the survey, I show them what the classroom response patterns look like at the top end, in the middle, in the low. And then we engage teachers together in conversations to speculate and share ideas about how is it teachers signal to students that they love to help them. Okay, how is it that teachers signal to students that they're not going to let them give up when the work gets hard, or that they really care that students come to class on time. And we show them that there are a number of classrooms in the building where 95% of the kids say totally true or mostly true to these positive things. There are other classrooms in the building where only 35% of the kids say totally true or mostly true. So the answers are in the building, but there has to be a teacher professional community and a discourse organized through which they can share their best thinking, and also at times bring students in to put ideas into that mix.
I think it's a great question, Heather. I think a couple of things. I think the problem, of course, and I don't know if when Ron first started using deficit, if anybody sort of went, ugh, because the word deficit, of course, I mean, the sort of liberal fear he's talking about is a real one, the fear of stigmatizing. The problem with the idea of deficit is that the word deficit, rather, is that it often veers into conversations about cultural deficit, not about skill deficit, about specifically what do these kids need that I will harm them if I don't give them. That's a very different conversation about deficit than the cultural deficit one. So I think it's concretizing the analysis of, again, behaviors. What am I doing vis-a-vis my kids that's enabling or disabling them on the road to achievement? And I think we had an interesting conversation. We met yesterday to sort of prepare for this and see if we had cross-cutting ideas, et cetera. And one of the things that in talking to Ron is, after Prudence had to leave, that we were thinking about was that, you know, in education, I think, have high expectations. That's the way you deal with the achievement gap. True, but we all kind of know it's become a mantra, but it doesn't seem to have effectuated the work that it needs to effectuate, right? And so we were talking about the need to sort of enact, again, I hate to keep harping on behavior, but enact in everyday behavior something like, I believe in my students' intellectual ability. How do you enact in everyday behavior something like, I care deeply about my children's success? And once again, it's not just purely a matter of sort of revamping your attitudes, but how do you enact these attitudes in everyday ways? And I think that, in terms of research, in terms of where we go on the achievement gap, the kind of stuff that Ron is doing, and all of us in different ways are doing, is trying to answer that enactment.
And part of just on the expectations issue, part of what we talked about yesterday was, in my experience, teachers' expectations change after a teacher has found something that works and produces high results. The expectation is not the input or the cause, it's the output and the product. The challenge is to find things to suggest to teachers that they try, to assist them with trying things that have a good shot at working, even if the teacher doesn't expect it to. And the teacher can be pleasantly surprised when it works, and they try it again and it works again, and then they say, hey, I can reproduce this. I'm expecting that next time I do this kid's going to perform at this level. And that's the way I tracked an experiment in the early, an effort in the early 1990s to put Marva Collins' ideas in the state of Oklahoma. And a lot of the teachers who started trying things did not expect that they were going to work, but they did work. And so you'd come with a teacher who would be amazed that it actually worked, and they would tell a story where it was clear that expectations change was the outcome, and they had started doing things at a point where they did not expect that it was going to work, but they wanted to be able to have something to report when people said, have you tried it yet?
I have a question about what are your thoughts about the role of principals or superintendents in this process? Because my observations have been, if you have a teacher who's high on performance and high on help, that can create a set of anxieties or political dynamics that flow outside of the classroom, and then they kind of sometimes wind up in the lap of a principal or headmaster who, if he or she's a politician and not an educator, what will happen to those teachers is eventually they're going to leave the system or get burnt out, whatever. So any thoughts about the kind of subtle influences that principals or administrators or department heads have in this ecological perspective that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, my first reaction to that is that the high expectation culture should not just be confined to one classroom or teachers' classrooms. It should be fundamentally embedded in the entire school and led by the principal as the kind of principal, the principal as the director of the school. And I think it should be a part of the common mantra of the school. I mean, I understand what you're saying, because in this testing and accountability era, particularly trying to maintain those high expectations, there is a lot of anxiety produced among kids, among teachers, parents, etc. But I think that one of the things is, creatively, teachers and principals have to make it a part of the entire school milieu. It can't be something just confined to one class, so their teacher is an exemplar of getting kids to achieve highly. And that's something that has to be conversation among both the principal and the teachers, I would argue.
There's a great deal of variation among principals and their leadership styles, and it's actually a rare principal who is willing to stake out a vision for the school and hold people accountable for meeting it. Most principals run very quickly to try to to relieve the pain, to let people go back to whatever they want to be doing. And so if you've got one or two teachers who are really go-getters, and to really go-getters, that can make other people uncomfortable, and other folks try to find ways to undermine them. But if you've got a principal who makes it clear, it's not okay where we are right now. We're going to raise the bar, and we're looking at all kinds of different places to find ideas for how to do that, and find ways to invite the stronger teachers out to share their ideas, because teachers cannot self-nominate to share their ideas. Because other people look at them, what makes you think you're so special that we want to know what you think? Okay? There has to be a community level kind of a process where everybody has the opportunity to share ideas. Everybody has a reasonable expectation that they're going to get some help if they need it, so that I don't have to have this ego protection dynamic where I don't think I'm going to be able to get any better, so I need to make it look like you're not any better than I am either. But instead I'm expecting we all really can get better, and we're going to work together at it as a team, not competing with each other, but competing with the world. And there's major work to do in equipping principals to strike the right balance in terms of stressing the school environment, but not stressing it too much. Too much stress kills the organism. Not enough stress leaves it at rest. And Marva Collins left the Chicago schools for exactly the reason that you talked about. That's why she set up her own school in Chicago. Her elementary school kids were telling the kids on the playground, oh, we're college bound, because she was telling them all they were college bound. The other teacher says, these are poor kids. It's not fair to them to tell them they're college bound. Principal, tell her to stop saying that. Okay. Her kids were choosing to stay in for recess because they were having so much fun on the lessons. The other teacher said, you've got to let your kids go out for recess. Okay. And they basically pushed her out of the school because she was a bit too good, too ambitious. And there are all kinds of twists on the issues that we need to cover when we talk about principal leadership. But it's a major piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, panel. I have a question about this type 4 classroom, this high help, high perfection. And I understand that this survey is in elementary, and I assume that it's ongoing. But my question is, how much difference does one classroom make? If these students, end up in a type 4 classroom, the high help, high perfection, and it's at one of the, if they're lucky enough that, as Dr. Carter says, to be in a school where the whole climate is one of type 4 classrooms, I would assume that the impact would be greater to follow them. But what if it's a pocket of wonderment? Like, what if you're in a school that just happens to be the only type 4 classroom that is, and it happens to be in one of those transition years, like 5th grade or 8th grade, and they move on to another school? I wonder if any of you know, or if you've done any sort of like follow-up studies of students who had this amazing experience with a teacher where they feel like they get help and they feel like they are held to high standards, and then they go off into the abyss of the type 1s.
There is a decay effect.
For the kids, right?
For the kids. I mean, I'm blanking on the guy's name from Kentucky that has done sort of the teacher, who knows? What's the name I'm trying to think of?
Done the what?
People can't think of it right now.
He's
done work to show, what he does is he looks at which teachers kids have had and the degree to which teachers tend to produce high test scores by the end of the year the kids have had with them. And he classifies teachers with regard to whether they're teachers whose kids tend to do really well on standardized tests or not so well, and so on. And among the things he talks about is if you've got I think it's 3 weak teachers in a row, you never recover. Also just having one strong teacher followed by folks who aren't strong. It helps to have been there, but over time you get the decay effect. Similarly, in the preschool literature, there's a decay effect in many of the Head Start kinds of studies, especially the black kids tend to lose the advantage. There is an advantage of having gone through Head Start to get the preschool boost, but the extra boost that you've gotten tends to decay across the years. We don't totally understand the dynamics and the reasons, but the dominant hypothesis is that kids from weak backgrounds, even if they go to Head Start and get a strong foundation, if they go to really weak schools, and especially if they come from homes that don't have strong intellectual climates, it just kind of squanders the advantages that they got. So it's not good enough to do it for 1 year. We've got to find ways to provide strong learning experiences across the whole spectrum.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you really take the ecological perspective seriously, you could draw this out much broader. I mean, that the Annenberg Center at Brown has been interested in working on sort of learning, can't remember the technical name they're calling them, but something about learning communities, but it's framing an entire neighborhood, for example, as a community, a neighborhood and its schools as a community. And there was an idea that has not yet gone anywhere that we were tossing around a little bit at Hugsy last year, the year before, about, and this is something I've grabbed onto because it's very germane to the work, the kind of thinking I do. To me, I think if you really want to deal with, my ideal to deal with the achievement gap would be an entire community, say where I live, Somerville, committing longitudinally to getting each and every kid in Somerville to the end of high school, with great skills allowing them to proceed. But if you really take this ecological perspective seriously, I think that's actually what would be necessary. You would need to have each player who's involved in this system understanding that it's on them too to get each and every kid to the end. So I think what you're picking up is a fundamental dynamic of some people feeling it's on them to get these kids to the end of the year, and then they enter the abyss. The problem is there are too many abysses in the system. Really strong schools can overcome a lot of bad parenting. Though, if you have, I mean, the data in the late 80s, I studied teachers' test scores and their predictive power in the state of Texas. If you have districts that's district-wide have among the highest teacher scores in the state, even if the kids in 3rd grade have really low teacher scores, gradually across the years those scores start coming up. And by the 11th grade, the average scores in these districts are equal to those where the kids' scores started off high as of 3rd grade and they had strong teachers. If you have schools that in 3rd grade, districts in 3rd grade, the kids' scores are pretty good, but the teacher scores are among the lowest in the state. Across the school year, those scores creep down so that by the 11th grade, their scores look like the kids who started off low.
in there. So the ecological thing, if we can get it right, is great. But we also shouldn't allow any particular set of actors to use that as an excuse that the rest of the ecology isn't put together. Marva Collins has this saying, I'm not going to use the trifling parent as an excuse not to teach this child. And she takes the kids that show up at school, if they're dirty, she'll wash them up and get them there. And she said, you talk like that at home, and it's okay to talk like that at home, but in my class, this is the way we speak, and this is the way we carry ourselves. And it works.
Well, let me follow up on this. One of the things is we're talking about the kind of ecological model, or even thinking about things, a way to ameliorate the academic achievement gap. We talk about the problem of the children and their scores and their grades. Then we talk about what we can do for policy or practice, and then we shift all the focus on the teachers and the educators, but we leave the children out of that in some ways. And I do a lot of talking to adolescents, and they tell me what disengages them. They have told me, they tell me what can get them attached to school, and how much of the problem solving actually fundamentally involves talking to them about what we can do pedagogically, what we can do in terms of curriculum, because they talk explicitly about what's boring, disengaging, not interesting. Now, mind you, there are kids, and we adults know certain things are good for them, and they need to learn these things no matter what. But we also know, if we listen to them, that there are certain things we're not even teaching them that they feel that are valuable to them. And particularly among black kids, I've had so many black kids to tell me, 1867 in U.S. history, blah, 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 blah. And it's not until they're much later in their adult lives that they actually learn something fundamentally historical about themselves and their ancestors and their descendants. We don't take that kind of stuff seriously. And I've heard these, you may say it's anecdotal, but I think we get more in-depth accounts if we actually listen to them about certain ways that teachers can go. And sometimes it's just not a bad idea. I ask my undergraduates, what else would you like to know? What kinds of things can I implement? If we can accord that to young adults, why couldn't we accord that to high school students or middle school students? Or what do you find interesting about this topic? I think that would also be a part of the problem solving. We leave them out of the actual solving of the problem many times, because we adults think we know all of the answers, and the kids don't know anything because they're too young or they're, adolescent.
Yeah, we found in the Tripod Project, we have these what we call kickoff meetings, and 10 or 15 minutes of it is a student panel. And the students are extremely insightful. And sometimes, depending on what the topic is, teachers just love to hear them and love to talk about them. We ask kids in the meeting just before school starts, what do you like about the way the teachers run the first day of class? What do you think, hope they don't do the first day of class? And across all kinds of schools, kids say, well, there's too much talk about rules on the first day. We've been in school a while. We kind of know what the rules are. If you got a new rule, a special one, tell us that one. But the rest of them we kind of know. The other thing they say is we like to know something about our teachers so we can relate to them better, and maybe also talk to our classmates so we can relate to them. That's the first meeting. The second meeting is about balancing teacher control and student autonomy, where the kids start to critique teachers' classroom management pieces a bit. Teachers don't like that too much. The kid who's a little bit too insightful about the way the teachers manage misbehavior and so on. It leaves the teachers thinking about it, but it's the kind of meeting that, at least in a couple schools, led the teachers to decide they're not going to have another meeting like that because they don't want to hear. And in very strong schools sometimes, people say, they're adolescents. Who are they to tell us how to teach? We'll get together again and talk about teaching, but we don't need to hear from these students. And so trying to work with teachers in a way that they can put their egos in their back pocket and listen to students in a way that they can learn to students is another piece, because students tend to be extremely insightful, even down to third grade. At the elementary years, we often have third graders on these panels, and they're saying stuff you didn't know third teachers. Their critique of teaching, and we say don't mention any teacher's name, it's a very insightful, deep critique at times, and I totally agree. For all kinds of things we could talk to kids more about. And I think we'll, two more, one you and one after you, then we'll depart, I think.
As public discussion of the achievement gap becomes more prominent, what impact do you think students' own growing awareness of this issue will have on their own learning?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I was having a conversation with a student yesterday who said, until I read this research, I didn't even realize that I could succumb to these kinds of things. And sometimes, actually, we can inculcate these kinds of narratives about ourselves. I do think that Claude Steele is on to something with the stereotype vulnerability theory. I think the more we push this in the media about black kids and underachievement and Latino kids and underachievement, that is going to become so concretized that these kids may start to, self-fulfilling prophecy, succumbing to the self-fulfilling prophecy. I think as much as we talk about black and minority underachievement, we also need to be talking about black and minority success and how to do it. We have to neutralize the effects of that, because I do think that it can become, it can be anxiety-producing. Stereotypes can, as the experiments have shown, can actually create different results, and we need to take that seriously. So I think that's one of the powerful things, the power of the narrative. And it's very important, yeah.
Yeah, I would add most definitely that, as I was saying, that the not talking about achievement gaps can naturalize them as if they're fine and acceptable. Talking about them can also naturalize them as if they're normal and expected, and can be very damaging for young people. And I think a lot of people, the question for us is, I think, what kind of talk about the achievement gap enables people to deal with it? And what kind of talk about the achievement gap disables various people from dealing with it? And I think a lot of people are doing research that demonstrates that both educators and young people who sort of gain tools for critically analyzing the school worlds that they're embedded in have a much better time navigating them themselves. So a lot of people are talking about this for young people. That was the question. That simply saying you're probably going to fail is obviously not giving somebody a critical analysis. Saying to a young person, here's the pattern that awaits the nation. Let's talk very concretely about how we're not going to produce that. A critical analysis of schooling systems, of the kind of institutional cultures that Prudence was talking about. A lot of people have been saying that critical thinking about schooling itself can actually be an aid for young people. So if the achievement gap is talked about in that context as something that's dismantleable by us, then I think that it's an enabling discourse.
Let me end by, were you going to go? Okay, well, let me say something that won't be the ending thing then for the moment. Just for this, those of you in this audience ought to be made aware that between 1971 and 1988, we cut 2/3 out of the black-white reading score gap nationally in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. 2/3 is a huge chunk to take out in 17 years. Over roughly the same period, we cut 1/3 out of the math score gap in the trend assessment and the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Anybody who in 1970 said it couldn't be done would have some explaining to do by the late 1980s. So even just for what we tell ourselves, it's important for us all to know that we have made huge progress over the last several decades. We haven't made too much progress over the last 15 years or so, but progress is possible, and as Prudence and Mica said, we need to let students know that progress is possible for them in their schools, and to celebrate it when they make it, and to understand that we're serious about working on this. Last comment, question.
I just wanted to point out, I'm a teacher who's, I'm from Ohio, and I'm in the group that's part of what Dr. Ferguson's been doing. I teach in Shaker Heights along with my colleague, and there's a couple things that I think are being kind of swirled around that I just wanted to point out. And one is that there's an issue within the teacher kind of community, especially in the district where I am, which is a multicultural school district, where it is not always seen as appropriate to address differences or deficits, especially coming from white teachers. To discuss those kind of comes off oftentimes as being racist or being inappropriate in terms of how you're interpreting information. And I think that the point that we get from it as being a part of, and our data is up there, that's part of what you're showing, is that we need to, I agree, work with the students more and talk to them more and bring the whole community in, as well as the parents, into this whole dialogue, because nothing is going to change by just changing teachers or just changing students or just changing parents, but the whole cycle needs to be completed. And I've been a part of what Dr. Ferguson's doing with working with other teachers and trying to get us to figure out what we can do better. And we're already seeing some huge changes in the context of that. And so the data here is, I wanted to point out, it is making changes. They're small and they're subtle and they're going to take time. This is a longitudinal thing, I would agree. But it is, we are moving in the right direction.
And some of the movement is due to the role that you're playing, and I thank you for that. Okay. We're done for the evening. Thank you for being here.